Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel, with your host Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Well, hello everyone out there in cyber world.
Cyber world.
It's good to have you join us to Truth Be Told. And today is session 92. We're knocking on the door of 100.
You know, that's my mother-in-law's age, 92. And it took her
92?
a whole lot longer to get to 92 than we have with Truth Be Told.
Hey, so once we get past 100 sessions, will it be like the TV programs that if they go past 100 episodes, they get lifetime residuals from the reruns? Or are we going to get the residuals for the rest of our life every time someone watches?
I hope so. We'll take whatever freebies.
What is the residual amount of zero?
Let me see. Carry the one. No, I don't know.
So anyway, welcome to session number 92. Today is April the 3rd, 2024. A beautiful spring day here in the Central Valley of California. Right outside my office window is the most beautiful pink dogwood tree in full bloom. And it is gorgeous.
And they have a fragrance too, right?
Not much.
Not much, okay.
Not much, but I have a lilac bush right around the corner.
Oh, I love lilac.
In full bloom, and they are very fragrant.
Yes.
And every time I go outside and turn the corner toward where my garbage cans are on the side of the house, we have a couple of jasmine bushes. And I love jasmine.
I love jasmine.
It just reaches out and grabs a hold of you.
Yes. Very fragrant.
There are two orange trees in our backyard are starting to blossom, and they always argue or discuss every year, and then we have right outside our patio door, back door of our kitchen, as soon as you walk outside is a big gardenia bush.
Oh, you're killing me.
Everywhere we discuss, what is a better smell, a gardenia, citrus blossoms, or jasmine, or lilac?
Oh.
And each of them are very sweet, fragrant.
Yeah.
And I don't have allergy problems, so they don't bother me. They're just totally pleasurable.
Yeah. Well, gardenias remind me of when Vicki and I were in Hawaii.
Oh, yeah.
And so that would instantly take me back there. I mean, yeah. Let's just describe all of these as, in terms of the fragrance, as divine.
So what is blooming in Missoula, Montana right now? Sorry, Mike.
I can't think of anything offhand, but I know that some people would have daffodils would be popping up probably right about now. We're getting close to tulips would be probably on the horizon. And so the early spring flowers. But outside of that, not a whole lot. In fact, yesterday hit almost 70 degrees. Today we're probably in the 50s, I think, and going to have a thunderstorm coming in.
Did you get all that, Braden Burnham? And our session is going to be a little bit shorter than normal today, so what the viewers and listeners will be happy about is that we don't have time to get into the politics of the day, because there's a lot to talk about, isn't there?
Yes.
We wanted to get into the politics of the first part of April of this year.
Mm-hmm.
But we will have plenty of politics and world events to talk about in the months to come, because this promises to be a very active year in both.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So we've been going through Deuteronomy, looking for Christ primarily, but talking about other things of the things of Christ and of his people by extension. And we looked at some key Hebrew words last time that was very interesting. And we're long about chapter 7, 8, 9 in there, working our way through. So I wanted to bring up a few things in general before we run out of time. First of all, I've mentioned in the past that Deuteronomy, one way to describe it in my mind is Exodus in New Testament language. But another way to describe it is an Old Testament book in New Testament language or principles. It really is kind of a unique book. And every time I read through it and look at it, it is more beautiful than ever. It's just a terrific book. Lays down many, many, many of the principles that the New Testament writers develop in their letters. And maybe another way to describe Deuteronomy, and then I'm going to give an example of what I mean. It's like a train terminal, like Grand Central Station, or maybe like a airport terminal where many planes or trains are coming in and out, but they're all connected at a central hub. And I really think Deuteronomy is one of the very few books of the Bible that connects itself so well to all the other parts of the Bible, the other books and the other subjects, the other doctrines, you might say. Deuteronomy is just kind of that way. It connects the law, connects the prophets, it connects the New Testament. It just connects so many of the other parts of the Bible that it's almost like the hub of a wheel or spokes going out to the other parts of the Bible. And let me give you an example of that. In fact, I may just turn over there in Matthew chapter 4, that famous story of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan. And, we all know it well enough to know that Jesus was able to counter or defeat Satan by quoting Scripture. So everything Satan tried to tempt him with, he responded with Scripture. But what's interesting to me is that most of the Scripture quotes he used to defeat Satan, to counter his arguments and testing, were from the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, 3 distinct scriptures that Jesus quotes in his own defense is from the book of Deuteronomy. So in Matthew 4:4, he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." That's a quote from Deuteronomy 8:3. And then down in verse 6, when Satan tempted him to jump off the pinnacle of the temple and see if the angels would protect him, he said in verse 7, "It is written again in the same book, Deuteronomy, you shall not tempt the Lord your God." That's Deuteronomy 6:16. And then finally, down in after Satan showed him the kingdoms of the world and said, "If you bow down, I'll give these to you if you fall down and worship me," which is kind of an interesting challenge because Jesus knew all the kingdoms of the world are going to be given to him by the Father. But basically, Satan was saying you can have them, a few thousand years early.
Right.
Which I don't know that would be much of a temptation to Jesus because he knows they're all coming to him eventually. But Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." And that's a quote from Deuteronomy 4:10. So other than a quote from a couple of verses in Psalms, Jesus focused on the book of Deuteronomy as his defense. So there's something about that particular book that seemed to hold a special place in the mind and heart of Christ during his temptation. So I think we need to look at the book as a whole as even all the scriptures are inspired. We know that all of them belong in the Bible. They're important. It's almost like the book of Deuteronomy holds a special place in God's attention. And the fact that Jesus purposely quoted from that one book most of the time in the temptation, in some way shows its importance in his thinking. And so it should be important in our thinking as well. So I don't know if you noticed it quite that way, but the prominence of the book of Deuteronomy and the temptation of Christ.
Yes, I did notice that. I'm curious to know how many times overall was Deuteronomy quoted
in the New Testament. So you're doing a little quick search?
I am.
Well, we do know that chapter 6 and verse 5 is the number one great commandment. So at least 3 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's brought up. And in essence, it's brought up throughout the entire New Testament in different wording, but they all had Deuteronomy 6:5 in mind as the first of the 2 great commandments. So that weaves its way. Deuteronomy 6:5 weaves its way all through the New Testament.
Well, here's the results, and this was that application I was telling you about, perplexity.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked the question. Where's my question? Oh, how many times is Deuteronomy quoted in the New Testament? That was my question. It came back with the book of Deuteronomy is referenced in the New Testament about 60 times. 60 with 44 direct quotes. Deuteronomy is one of the 4 Old Testament books quoted most often in the New Testament, along with Genesis, Psalms, and Isaiah. Mm-hmm. Jesus quoted Deuteronomy more than any other book in the Old Testament. For example, Matthew 4:1-11, which is where you were, Rick. He uses Deuteronomy 8:3, which describes the Holy Spirit leading Jesus into the desert to undergo the devil's testing. Jesus also answered all 3 of his temptations in the wilderness with quotes from Deuteronomy. At least 7 New Testament epistles contain quotations from Deuteronomy, perhaps the most significant of these being Galatians 3:10-14. In this passage, Paul writes that Christ has redeemed us from the curse of which Deuteronomy speaks, Deuteronomy 21:23, by describing a curse for us. So that was Perplexity's answer to my question.
I like that. I'm going to have to look that up. Look up that website. That was good and quick and right to the point.
Right to the point. Yeah.
So Jesus fulfilled Deuteronomy 21:23 by hanging on a tree. Mm-hmm. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Mm-hmm. So even at the death of Christ, Deuteronomy is central. Mm-hmm. So we really cannot underestimate. And then even beyond the what you said, 60 mm-hmm. quotes and direct references in the New mm-hmm. Testament, there are certain underlying principles in the book of Deuteronomy that are developed throughout the Bible that are not necessarily direct quotes, but they play a large role in the development of those subjects. For instance, I was looking at, I'd never noticed this before, and some people might say I'm making a stretch out of this, but I don't think so. The last verse in chapter 7, the Lord's talking to them about idolatry and beware of idolatry and so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons they were supposed to kill the people of Canaan, because of idolatry. Mm-hmm. But he said, verse 25 and 26, you shall burn the carved images of their gods with fire. You shall not covet the silver or gold that is on them, or take it for yourselves, lest you be snared by it, for it is an abomination to the Lord your God. Nor shall you bring an abomination into your house, lest you be doomed to destruction like it, but you shall utterly detest it, utterly abhor it, for it is an accursed thing. And I guess one reason why these two verses really jumped out at me is because of my Tuesday night end time sessions I'm doing.
Yeah.
2 Thessalonians 2 right now, so I'm really focused on the Antichrist, how his character is developed all through the Old Testament, carried over into the New Testament, much more than most people realize. And the underlying principle, in 2:4 of 2 Thessalonians 2, where he goes into the temple of God, declares himself that he is God, that he is above every God. That's a quote from Daniel 11:36, showing that Paul had Daniel and Matthew 24 clearly in mind when he wrote 2 Thessalonians 2, which somebody like Paul naturally would have somebody like Daniel and Jesus in mind. As a Jew, Daniel, and as a Christian Jew, Christ.
Yes.
So Daniel, 2 Thessalonians 2 is just basically Paul's rewording of parts of Daniel and parts of Matthew 24. And the reason that's important is if you know that and have that in mind, it helps clarify what Paul is actually talking about in 2 Thessalonians 2. It helps answer some important questions. Last night I dealt with what is the apostasy of 2 Thessalonians 2:3.
The falling away, yes, yeah.
And I tried to make a case that the apostasy, beyond what we normally describe it as those falling away from departing from the faith, which is part of it, but the actual apostasy Paul had in mind there, calls it the apostasy, which means it's one familiar to him from the Old Testament, from the Bible of his day. And I tried to make a case that it's actually verse 4 is describing what Paul means by the apostasy. It's the defiant spirit of Antichrist going into the temple, defying God, breaking the covenant, declaring himself to be God, making up all his own rules. It is the same spirit that Lucifer had in heaven when Lucifer rebelled against God. And so what happened in heaven now happens on the earth. And I think many people miss that application, but I think what Paul had in mind in particular was what the Antichrist was getting ready to do in verse 4, the abomination of desolation. Anyway, I go through all that, and that video will come out in the next few days. But the reason I brought all that up is back in Deuteronomy 7:25 and 26. So all this is on my mind. And then I read these two kind of verses and I think, like verse 26, nor shall you bring an abomination into your house. That's exactly what Antichrist is going to do, isn't it?
Yes.
He's going to bring an abomination, an idol, that image that he develops probably with AI or some advanced improvement on AI, whatever that might be at the time. It is in essence bringing an idol into their house.
Yes.
Say, well, it's not really the house of God, it's a false temple and all that kind of stuff. But to the Jews, it will be their house. And this man will bring an abomination into their house. And God said, don't do that. Don't allow that.
Right.
And God says the punishment will be, you'll be doomed to destruction. What is it more than anything else that will doom Antichrist to destruction? Is that abomination of desolation. That's what seals the deal for him, his fate.
Yeah.
And I guess what my point is Deuteronomy is not just quoted or directly referenced in the New Testament. It brings up certain foundation or root ideas like this that later develop into what we call the abomination of desolation, being brought into what Israel will consider the house of God. And God's punishment is doomed to destruction. So if any of you watching this or listening to this later think I'm stretching things too far, I'm just, I'm developing, I think, a better mindset of looking for the roots and foundations of what is later developed in the Bible, in these books of Moses. And
well, I like what you said earlier. Paul being a Hebrew Christian, as well as a what did you say? No, he's Jewish, but he's now a Christian, right? I mean, so
yeah. So Daniel and Jesus would both be prominent
yes,
in his thinking.
Yes. So from his perspective, I mean, he studied the law. He knew the law and the Old Testament backwards and forwards. And so you've also said from time to time that we can't just go into the New Testament and isolate a passage as if it didn't have a premise, some precedent, something somewhere in the Old Testament. It's all rooted there.
All rooted there.
And so that's what you're doing. You're just saying, okay, well, he's not just randomly throwing out things here. He's got to be, in his mind, being Jewish and knowing the Old Testament, he's undoubtedly tying it to something he already knew. And so I like your thoughts.
It's just a mindset to develop when you're reading the New Testament. And that's what, your son Andrew emailed us the other day about Isaiah, studying, reading through Isaiah.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's partly what, the ideas we've brought up or what, but he said, one of the things he said I thought was interesting. He said, I'm trying to also figure out how often in the New Testament, they refer back to what Isaiah said.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, it's one of the four most quoted or referenced books in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And Isaiah is all over the place in the New Testament. And so if you just kind of have that mindset when you're reading the New Testament, where might the roots of this be in the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm.
Might be shocked at how almost every time there's as I often say, people get tired of me saying it probably, but almost always it starts with Moses.
Mm.
And then the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
And then the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
And they all build on each other. They quote each other. They read each other. Was it 1 Peter 1, I think it is? Not 2 Peter, yeah, 1 Peter 1, where it says that they diligently searched. The prophets diligently searched. What did they search? Each other's writings. They were Bible students. Just because they were inspired to write their own book did not mean they were inspired to understand everything everyone else wrote.
Well,
and
do you think
they searched each other's writings and learned from it and developed it in their own writings under inspiration?
they cross-checked, hyperlinked? They did all of that. Where is that verse that says this thing wasn't done in a corner? Who said that? Somewhere in the New Testament. This thing isn't done in a corner. And
this thing was not done in a corner.
Was that Paul? Was somebody? Anyway, my point being that they would refer back to something earlier written so that the people of their generation wouldn't think that this is something just a new startup, as if it had no earlier connection, no private interpretation, that they're relying on things said earlier from which they're building now. And so this thing isn't done in a corner. We're not starting this thing up from scratch as if it did have no base. And so they'd always reach back to the Old Testament for their base to give credibility to what their generation was witnessing now. To always make that connection. There's one guy who puts it this way. It's called chain of custody. You've heard of that expression?
Chain of custody, yeah.
Yeah. So that's really what these apostles were doing, was establishing a chain of custody. How that what they're preaching today in their generation, first century, had validity because it was backed up by previous links in that chain. They didn't just start a new chain. It goes way back to, like you said, the law, the prophet, and the Psalms. It goes way back to those writings. They're just bringing them forward in a new application for that generation, namely the ecclesia.
Yeah.
So
good point.
I'll have to look at that. This thing wasn't done in a corner. I don't remember.
It was one of Paul's defenses before Sanhedrin or Agrippa or Felix. I think that it seems to fit right there, doesn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, I'll just grab my trusty concordance that I don't. These are the kind of times when I prefer just grabbing the book, because if I go to an online program, then an hour later I'm chasing rabbits. Whereas this, I just look at corner, and I look at.
I looked up corner.
Acts 26:26.
Acts 26:26. There you go.
What is that in? What is that, Agrippa?
Let's see.
Acts 26:26.
You're right. It's Agrippa.
Yep.
So you're right. It was one of his defenses. And so Paul was telling Agrippa, look, this isn't done in the corner. I mean, it has validity to it. I mean, and that's why they would quote these Old Testament scriptures, because it wasn't some new thing other than the formation of the ecclesia. That itself was built on the authority of Christ, with its first members who were under the Old Testament covenant. And so it's all connected, chain of custody.
Then I also wanted to look at a passage in chapter 8, verses 10 through 18. Made a little note here, because one of the things that God constantly was trying to rebuke them over, to get rid of in them, to warn them about, was the sin of presumption and pride. And he says in 8:10, when you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. You take a verse like that, you wonder, are we supposed to also give a blessing for the food we just ate instead of ahead of time? Because this wording, it seems to indicate after, when you've eaten and are full. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, when your herds and your flocks multiply, your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up. Boy, that's a warning for the churches in America right now. It's so easy for us to think we did it. And you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness. How many dozens or hundreds of times does he bring the same thing up? All through their history, reminding them. In which were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the rock of flint, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you. So God's blessings are for the purpose of humbling us, not lifting us up. A heart of gratitude for his blessings on us, not a mindset of, look what I have done. And we know what he did to Nebuchadnezzar because of that attitude. That he might humble you and that he might test you and to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gained me this wealth. Well, that is a dangerous attitude to develop. And all of us allow that to creep in from time to time. Whether it be, maybe we're just handy at building things, or with art, or preachers with sermons developing, real flashy outlines and illustrations. And it's more about the style than the substance. And we get thinking too highly of ourselves. God has blessed us with these things, and we start taking credit for it. He says in verse 18, and you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, you'll perish, and so forth. But that is his ongoing sermon against Israel about the sin of presumption and pride, but it doesn't stop with them. It continues in us today.
That's an interesting
classic.
verse 18. I'll just call your attention to that again that you just read. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And so it seemed like he was prospering them so that they could continue on as a covenant people. So that was his every intention. So they could build houses, raise a godly seed, and carry on the covenant and all of its principles. And so when they, if they should move away from God, they're really moving away from that covenant. One goes hand in hand.
Yes, it does. And so he's talking about having a recognition of where the blessings come from, giving God the glory and credit. He continues this. Really, what we're talking about is he's talking about grace. Everything you have is by my mercy and grace.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And so in chapter 9, verse 4, he continues that same idea. Do not think in your heart after the Lord your God has cast them out before you, saying, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of those nations that the Lord is driving them out from before you. It is not because of your righteousness. Now we are to obey. We are to live a righteous life. We're to live by the principles of Christ, have his mind and heart and spirit. But we're not to take credit for any of it. It's not our righteousness, it's his righteousness. Or the uprightness of your heart. It's his uprightness that we're trying to follow and apply to our life. Of your heart that you go in to possess their land. But because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God drives them out from before you. And number 2, that he might fulfill the word which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's that covenant again. Why am I driving these people out and giving you the land and blessing you? Number 1 is because these people are wicked and deserve to be wiped out. Number 2, I made a promise to your fathers.
Yeah.
So in verse 6, therefore understand that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people.
Ouch.
In spite of you.
Yeah, right. In spite of you. Yeah.
In spite of you.
Yeah.
Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness from the day that you departed from the land of Egypt. So, we go back in Exodus and it says after 3 days they had no water and they began to complain, think, well, it didn't take long. It took 3 days. No, evidently there was something that first day. From the day that you departed from the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord. So don't get so high-minded about yourself, because even at your best, you're not that great. And anything you have is because it's been given to you by God's good mercy and grace.
One thing they discovered is that God has a great memory.
There's one other thing I wanted to bring up. Maybe you have a few things before we close, but I have to get you on here pretty quick. I hadn't noticed this before, but you brought it up. I brought this up elsewhere. This 7 + 1 = 8 principle. And there's really a principle scattered through the Bible. You see it in the feast days, especially, that there's 7, a set of 7. So that's the number of perfection or completeness. And it is. But often again, if you have a mindset, you'll find it more than you think. Whenever you come across like a list of 7 things or the number 7 used in a particular way, God trying to show perfection or completeness,
Mhm.
Look a few verses before and a few verses after. And often you'll find another item that's kind of connected to those 7, but kind of separated off a little bit.
Uh-huh.
And it's this 7 plus 1 equals 8 principle of, yes, 7 is complete, but 1 equals 8, which is a number of new birth, new beginnings, all things new.
Mhm.
And so it's kind of connected, but it's a little bit separate at the same time. And so I found another one of these, and you've asked me to kind of compile a list of all these. And one of these decades, I'll try to get to that. But you'll see it, of course, you'll see it in the feast days.
Yeah.
You have
Yeah.
Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. So they're so closely tied together, they're actually called the same by the
Mhm.
same terms in a few places in the Gospels. And yet the Passover is a particular day, but so closely connected that 7 days of unleavened bread that it's basically the same, but it's different. 7 plus 1. And then at the end of the year, the Feast of Tabernacles is 7 days in their booths, and they come out and have an 8th day of celebration.
Mhm.
And but it's not just in the feast days; it's a number of places. And here's one in chapter 8, verse 8. He's describing the goodness of the land, and in verse 8 he says, "A land of wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey." There's 7 items listed there.
Mhm. Mhm.
But if you back up a verse, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, fountain springs flow out of valley and hills." So water is added to the 7, which makes the 7 possible. Without the 8, the 7 is not possible.
Mhm.
So it's 7 as a separate unit, but the 8 is so closely connected to it, the water that gives it life. But for some reason, the Lord kind of separated it off a little bit. So the 7 plus 1 equals 8 principle pops up in places you just normally wouldn't look for. Here it is right here.
Mhm.
So you go find a bunch more for me.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
So what would you like to add briefly? I have to get going here pretty quick.
I don't think I need to add anything. I think as short as it was, I think it was very robust. I think our viewers will be blessed, and always we encourage them to write in with a question or with more information that they could provide. Go ahead and hit us up on our YouTube channel or directly email Brother Rick, and he'd be glad to answer your
Or
questions.
I prefer my elder brother.
Come on, you're playing that card again, are you?
As often as I can. I don't get to play it that often anymore.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Well, thank you, Brother Rick. I really enjoyed this. Very good.
Well, thank you, Mike. I just jotted down about 7 quick thoughts in these 2 chapters, and it seemed to, at least enough to where those who watch or listen can take and run with some of these.
Yeah.
Develop them further.
Yeah. And I think as often as Deuteronomy is quoted in the New Testament, that shows how important it was to those writers. I don't think our viewers would mind, camping out in Deuteronomy for a while.
Yeah, we our friend Braden Barnum reminded us the other day in email that he wants to join us when we get to Joshua. I think it was 4 and 5.
Okay.
And he told us recently. And so I asked him to remind us, and he said, "Yeah, Joshua 4 and 5, I think it is." And so my reply to him was, "Well, okay, we should get there sometime in 2025. We still have to get through Deuteronomy, but I think we'll get there before then."
Yeah.
But,
was that Joshua 4 verse 5 or chapters 4 and 5?
Chapters 4 and 5, I think. Yeah. So we'll have to remind ourselves to bring him in when we get there. And it may not be all that long. I do know when we get to chapter 31 and 32, I want to really develop that pretty thoroughly.
Mhm.
But a lot of the chapters between where we are and the end of the book rehearses a lot of the laws that Exodus did.
Mhm.
So there might be chunks of chapters that we're able to just jump over briefly,
Okay.
and we may get to the end of the book, in another half a dozen sessions or so.
Yeah. Hit the highlights. Yeah. Yeah.
And then get into Joshua, because there's quite a bit there about Christ, of course. They
Mhm.
shared a name together,
Yes.
Joshua
Right.
and Jesus.
Mhm.
So thanks for your time, Mike. And
Well, thank you.
I'll let me see, maybe the 1st of April. So what is it, about Memorial Day or so? You'll be starting springtime there. Is it going to be how it works? Got Memorial Day?
Yeah, we could say that. Every year is different, but we'll springboard off of
Giving you a
that
bad
thought.
time.
Yeah, yeah. Springboard off of that thought. Yeah.
There
Memorial
is a
Day.
reason, just maybe one thought in closing, because this is real common in history, and it even says it some in the Bible, the book of Kings and Chronicles and Samuel, I think. The
Mhm.
time of the year when the kings would go to battle.
Yes, right. Yes.
That would mean early summer, because for most of the world, it's way too, either snow is melting or a lot of rain in the spring or things like that, and it's way too muddy, to go out to battle.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so you got to wait till the ground firms up and the rains and snow stops and all that. And for a lot of the world, that's long about our Memorial Day.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's
yeah,
that. If they were itching for a battle with their enemy, they'd normally wait till like early summer,
yeah.
and then often they would try. Okay, let's get this over within a couple months because our men have to go home and harvest the crops. So summer was the big season for battle
Yeah, yeah.
history in most of the world.
I wonder if any of those kings put a little bit wider tires on those chariots just to handle the mud.
If they did, they had an advantage over their enemies. They could attack them
Yeah,
a
yeah,
month earlier than normal,
right.
and they're unprepared.
Yeah, right.
Adios,
Uh,
Mike. Thanks, everyone. God bless.